Picture two men living in the same city, both 32 years old, each with $75,000 saved and earning $85,000 a year. One decides to purchase a house, the other continues renting. 2 decades pass, and the outcomes look completely different. The homeowner ends up with a paid-off property worth well over $500,000, while the renter builds an investment portfolio that even surprises him. And everyone who once assumed rent meant wasted money. This is where the rent versus buy argument usually goes off the rails. The pro-ownership side jumps straight to the finish line, pointing at future property value as if that alone settles the debate. The pro-renting side counters with mobility, lifestyle freedom, and convenience, but often ignores what that freedom costs over decades. In reality, neither story is complete. Both leave critical pieces out of the equation. In this breakdown, nothing gets left behind. We account for mortgage interest that quietly dominates early payments, closing fees that appear suddenly at signing, rising property taxes that track home value upward, and the ongoing upkeep costs that rarely make it into polished online advice. Then we include the factor almost no one models honestly. What happens if the renter takes the money they didn't put into a down payment and continuously invests it over 20 years instead? By the end, you'll see a realistic break-even point between renting and buying. Understand why the idea of throwing money away on rent is far less accurate than it sounds, and learn when owning a home truly wins financially versus when renting comes out ahead. Before diving in, if you want this kind of fully transparent financial breakdown, subscribing helps a lot. This channel focuses on real calculations behind big money decisions, not simplified narratives designed for clicks, but results that actually survive spreadsheet-level scrutiny. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future analyses. Now meet Adrian and Leo. Both are 32. Both earn $85,000 annually. Both have $75,000 in savings. Each is currently renting in the same mid-sized city. A similar 3-bedroom home in a solid neighborhood is listed at $420,000. Adrian chooses to buy. He puts down the entire $75,000, landing at roughly 20%, which lets him avoid private mortgage insurance. He locks in a 30-year mortgage at about 6.8% interest. His monthly principal and interest comes out to roughly $2,450. On top of that, he pays around $420 in property taxes, about $170 for insurance, and sets aside roughly $350 each month for maintenance, close to that 1% rule most conservative planners recommend. All in, Adrian's monthly cost of ownership lands near $3,390. Leo takes a different path. He renews his lease for a comparable home nearby at about $2,300 per month. Instead of tying up his savings in a down payment, he invests the full $75,000 into a broad stock market index fund. On top of that, he invests the monthly difference between his rent and Adrian's total housing cost, letting compounding do the heavy lifting over time. At first sight, Leo appears to have pulled off a smart financial maneuver. He's renting a similar place and paying close to $1,000 less each month than Adrian, while keeping his entire investment portfolio fully active in the market. In that snapshot moment, it almost looks like he's winning. Yet there's a hidden layer to this comparison that rarely gets acknowledged. The moment Adrian finalizes the purchase, he doesn't start from a clean slate. He begins already behind, and the gap is larger than most people expect. For a property priced around $420,000, closing costs typically fall in the 2 to 5% range. Once lender fees, title services, legal expenses, prepaid taxes, and escrow funding are all included, the upfront requirement swells quickly. Adrian shows up with $75,000 prepared, but after everything is accounted for, his real entry point lands closer to $84,090. Before ownership even has a chance to build momentum, that shortfall has to be recovered. It's not emphasized in most sales pitches because it makes the early phase look harsh, but it is very real and paid immediately at closing. This is where the clean rent versus buy narrative starts to fall apart. Mortgage payments are often imagined as direct steps toward ownership, but in the early years of a 30-year loan at roughly 7%, that assumption barely holds. Look closely at Adrian's breakdown. With a monthly payment of $1,863, The first month alone sends about $1,633 straight to interest. Only around $230 actually chips away at the loan balance. Then add approximately $350 for property taxes, $150 for insurance, and close to $290 for maintenance. Suddenly, his true monthly cost rises to about $2,623, money spent without an equivalent rise in ownership value. That $230 slice is the only portion truly building equity at the start. The idea that rent is wasted money sounds convincing on the surface, but the comparison becomes less obvious under these conditions. Adrian is effectively spending $2,623 each month, most of which doesn't translate into ownership growth, while Leo is paying about $2,300 in rent. In that early stage view, Leo is actually preserving more cash month to month. Now stretch the timeline out to 3 years, where theory meets what actually happens in real life. After 36 months, Adrian has poured roughly $95,500 into total housing expenses, including principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Yet only about $8,300 of that has reduced his loan principal. His remaining balance sits near $271,700. With property values climbing around 3 to 4% annually, the home is now estimated between $393,000 and $396,000. That leaves him with roughly $111,000 to $124,000 in equity. On paper, that looks like meaningful wealth creation, but it isn't easily accessible. It's locked inside the property, and turning it into cash would require selling costs of roughly 5 to 6%. During this period, ownership also brings real-world upkeep, a water heater replacement costing around $300 in the second year, and a wall repair that took both time and about $400 in materials. None of it is dramatic, but it all adds up. Over that same 3-year stretch, Leo has spent around $72,000 on rent. Meanwhile, his original $75,000 investment in a broad index fund has grown to approximately $93,000 under typical market conditions. His steady habit of investing $653 each month has now quietly built up another $27,000 in portfolio gains. Putting it all together, Leo's total invested wealth now sits at about $120,000. During this time, he's never had to panic over a broken water heater or rush to fix urgent home issues. Whenever something went wrong, he simply contacted his landlord and moved on with his life. By the close of year 3, Leo actually comes out slightly ahead when you focus only on liquid net worth. Adrian, meanwhile, appears wealthier on paper thanks to home equity, but that value is effectively frozen. It isn't something he can freely access unless he sells the home or takes on additional borrowing against it. Leo, on the other hand, can exit his index funds on any market day he chooses, without waiting, approval, or friction. If you're starting to notice which side of this debate often gets overlooked, taking a second to like the video really helps others discover this breakdown. It genuinely supports the channel. Now, let's keep going. Back into the numbers, and into the hidden costs that rarely make it into simple housing comparisons. One of the biggest is what happens when you exit. When Adrian eventually decides to sell, he'll be hit with a real estate commission, typically in the range of 5 to 6% of the sale price. On a $500,000 home, that alone wipes out roughly $25,000 to $30,000 before he ever sees the proceeds. When you add those selling costs to everything paid at purchase, the total friction of entering and later exiting homeownership often lands near 8 to 10% of the property's value. That means the home has to appreciate quite a bit just to clear that hurdle. Property taxes add another quiet but persistent layer of cost. Adrian's $350 monthly tax bill is based on a home assessed at around $350,000. But if that same home grows toward $500,000 over time, those taxes don't stay fixed. They rise along with it. So even if the mortgage payment stays the same, the overall monthly burden tends to creep upward. Leo's rent might also increase, but the property tax exposure is carried entirely by his landlord, not him. Then there's maintenance, the category most people consistently underestimate. Some years it's minor, a few $100s for small repairs, sealants, or replacements. Other years, reality hits harder with expenses like a $9,000 roof replacement, a $7,500 HVAC failure, or even a $4,000 structural fix. Over long time horizons, these costs are unavoidable. A homeowner who isn't actively setting aside reserves isn't escaping the expense, they're just postponing it. And finally, there's the opportunity cost that almost never gets written down. Adrian's $75,000 down payment is locked into the property the moment the deal closes. If that capital had instead remained invested and compounded at roughly 10% per year over 20 years, it could have grown to something close to $470,000 in a broad market index. That's not a direct loss. It's the alternative path that was given up in exchange for ownership. To keep things fair, you really have to account for both sides of the equation, not just the obvious highlights. Now we move into the year 10 and year 20 projections, and this is where the entire comparison begins to shift in ways that often surprise people on both sides of the argument. If you're following along, stick around. This is where the long-term divergence becomes impossible to ignore. By year 10, Adrian's property value climbs to somewhere in the range of roughly $483,000 to $500,000, assuming a steady annual growth rate of about 3% to 4%. After a decade, Adrian's outstanding mortgage sits at roughly $246,000. That leaves him with home equity in the range of about $237,000 to $254,000. Across those 10 years, he's also put another $30,000 to $40,000 into upkeep, fixes, and modest improvements. When you combine the down payment, closing expenses, and all payments beyond principal, his total cash spent lands somewhere around $160,000 to $185,000. Meanwhile, Leo has stayed fully committed to investing from the very beginning. His initial $75,000 has expanded to roughly $181,000. On top of that, he's been adding money consistently, about $580 each month on average, because his rent has been climbing around 3% per year, gradually shrinking the cost difference between his situation and Adrian's. Those ongoing contributions and market growth together add close to $110,000, bringing Leo's total liquid portfolio at year 10 to about $291,000. At this stage, Leo actually comes out ahead in liquid net worth. Adrian's equity, around $245,000 on average, still trails Leo's $291,000 in investable assets. But the dynamic is already starting to change in a subtle way. By year 10, Leo's rent has risen to roughly $2,690 per month. At this point, he's paying nearly the same monthly amount as Adrian, except none of it builds ownership. Adrian, on the other hand, is locked into a fixed mortgage payment that will stay in place for another 20 years, while Leo's rent continues its upward climb. Fast forward to year 20, Adrian's home is now valued between $670,000 and $700,000. His remaining mortgage has fallen to about $188,000, leaving him with equity in the ballpark of $482,000 to $512,000. Over the full 2 decades, he's also spent roughly $55,000 to $75,000 on maintenance. Despite rising costs everywhere else, his monthly housing expense has stayed anchored near that original $1,863 payment. Leo's portfolio at the 20-year mark has grown to approximately $550,000 to $580,000, assuming he stayed invested through market swings and continued contributing as much as possible. However, his rent has climbed to around $3,600 per month. As the years go on, his ability to invest heavily starts to fade because housing costs consume more of his income, and the earlier advantage of low living expenses disappears. Still, on paper, Leo is slightly ahead in total net worth at this point, with Adrian close behind in equity terms. The real divergence becomes clear at the 30-year mark. Adrian's mortgage finally disappears, and he owns a home outright worth somewhere between $850,000 and $950,000. His ongoing housing cost drops dramatically to only taxes, insurance, and maintenance, roughly $900 to $1,100 to $1,100 per month. Leo, however, is still renting, and by that point his rent has risen to around $4,700 to $5,000 per month, with no endpoint, no asset accumulation tied to it, and no long-term cap on his housing expenses. This is where the larger lesson becomes unavoidable. The rent versus invest strategy only holds up if the difference is consistently invested every single month, even during downturns when the urge to pause or move to cash feels strongest. All of the comparisons that make renting look superior are based on a very strict assumption that the renter takes the monthly savings and invests every cent of it without fail. But when we look at real-world behavior, that assumption starts to fall apart quickly. In practice, many renters don't consistently invest that gap at all. Instead, the extra cash tends to disappear into everyday choices, upgrading their lifestyle, booking an extra trip, or simply moving into a better apartment because the budget suddenly allows it. As balances grow, spending often grows with them. Home ownership works differently. A mortgage quietly forces a kind of financial discipline every month, whether you feel like saving or not. That automatic structure creates forced equity building, something spreadsheets rarely give proper credit for. For many average households, that built-in commitment is a major reason property ownership ends up generating more long-term wealth than clean theoretical models would suggest. Now it's important to be just as honest about the downside of buying, because skipping this part is how overly optimistic narratives are built. The timeline for breaking even is usually longer than most new buyers expect. Once you include upfront closing fees, costs on the way out when selling, and the fact that early mortgage payments are heavily interest-weighted, the point where buying actually beats renting plus investing often doesn't arrive until roughly 5 to 7 years in a stable market. If someone buys a property and resells it after only 3 years, there's a real possibility they come out behind compared to renting the whole time. Moving has a cost, and owning a home makes that cost significantly higher. Flexibility is reduced, and that reduction has a real financial price attached. Risk concentration is another factor that people often underestimate. Someone living in Detroit in 2006, Las Vegas in 2008, or other regional markets that later stalled or declined, understands what it feels like when your single biggest asset drops sharply in value, while still being impossible to easily adjust or rebalance. Meanwhile, Leo is spread across thousands of companies across many industries, while Adrian's entire financial life is tied to a single structure, on a single street, in a single neighborhood. Liquidity is another hidden issue. You cannot simply sell a small slice of a home to handle an emergency expense. Accessing equity usually requires refinancing or taking on additional debt, often at new rates and added cost. In other words, home equity is not the same as cash in hand. It's value that takes time, friction, and money to unlock. If you're finding this breakdown more practical than the simple always buy or always rent arguments, taking a moment to like the video helps it reach more people. And subscribing means you won't miss future breakdowns like this. The real answer is more conditional than most people want it to be. Buying tends to win when specific conditions are met. If you expect to stay in the same place for at least 7 to 10 years, transaction costs spread out enough that ownership starts to dominate, and the fixed payment becomes a long-term advantage. If the local price-to-rent ratio, the cost of buying divided by annual rent for a similar home, is under 20, ownership usually tilts in your favor, and when monthly rent is already close to what a full mortgage payment would be, the financial advantage of renting shrinks year after year. When a housing market is consistently climbing faster than the national trend, a mortgage can act like a force multiplier. In those environments, borrowed money doesn't just help you buy a home, it amplifies gains in a way most standard investment portfolios struggle to replicate. But that advantage doesn't hold everywhere. In fact, there are clear scenarios where renting comes out ahead. If you expect your life situation to change within the next 3 to 5 years, buying can become expensive in a way that isn't obvious at first glance. The entry and exit costs alone, fees, taxes, commissions, can erase much of the financial upside. When the local price-to-rent ratio climbs above roughly 25, the equation shifts again. In those conditions, renting and putting your monthly savings into consistent investments often outperforms ownership over long stretches of time. And there's another angle people underestimate: career flexibility. If staying mobile opens the door to better jobs or higher income, that optionality has real economic value, even if it never shows up in a spreadsheet. Of course, all of this depends on one critical condition. Renting only wins if the difference you save is actually invested. If you commit to that discipline, adding regularly, staying invested through downturns, never pausing, The long-term math starts to favor the renter's strategy. But then comes the bigger idea, the one that completely reframes the debate. What if this didn't have to be an either-or decision? Imagine purchasing a duplex, living in one unit, and renting out the other. Suddenly, part of your housing cost is offset by someone else's rent. In some cases, it can cover a large share of the mortgage while you still build equity. Or picture another path, buying in a steady, predictable market while continuing to invest in financial assets at the same time. Instead of choosing between property and portfolios, you do both in parallel. Once you combine strategies like this, the outcome shifts dramatically. The comparison we've been running changes shape entirely, and the long-term results don't look like either pure renting or pure buying. So before any decision gets made, two questions matter more than anything else. First, how long are you realistically staying? Second, if you choose to rent, will you truly invest the difference every single month without fail? Because everything else, every chart, every projection, every long-term outcome, depends on those answers. Not theory, not intentions. What actually gets done. And that's the version of this discussion that really matters in the end. If this breakdown helped clarify the real trade-offs between renting and buying, beyond the surface-level arguments, take a second to like the video. It helps more people find this kind of analysis. Subscribe for weekly deep dives where financial decisions are broken down with full transparency and real numbers behind them. And I'm curious, where do you stand on this? Are you leaning toward renting, buying, or sitting somewhere in between? I go through the comments, so I'll see you there. Until the next one.